So I've been dating my girlfriend for almost a year now, and last month we moved in together. Maybe that's kind of fast, I don't know. My parents sure thought it was, but honestly, everything was great in the beginning. We get along really well, and we've never had more than a brief argument. But then, she started whistling. It's dumb, I know, but she's always whistling this weird song, and it really gets on my nerves. My mum kept telling me that once you move in with someone, you discover all their weird quirks that they've been hiding from you. And it's not like I didn't expect that to be true, but for some reason, this is just an ongoing issue with us, and I don't know what to do. At first I would just hear her whistling it when she was showering. It was kinda cute, like her own little bathroom theme song. I didn't recognise the melody, but it was very distinct. I could mimic it from memory if I wanted to. In fact, sometimes it gets stuck in my head, and it drives me a little bit crazy. You know the type of tune. After a week or so, I asked her what the song was, and she just laughed. I'm wondering if maybe it's something she came up with on her own, something that she does absent-minded, especially once she started doing it more and more. Like, I'd be reading a book, and she'd be on the computer, and she'd just start whistling, and I tried to ignore it, I really did, but I seriously feel like a dick for being so grumpy about it. And I know she wasn't doing it to annoy me, but she'd just go on and on and on, and it would pull all my attention away from whatever I was doing. So I finally said something to her a few nights ago. I was going over some legal documents for work, and she just starts whistling like crazy, on, and I'm trying to just block it out, but it's seriously excessive. I know you guys are probably thinking that I was overreacting, but it felt like she was whistling right into my ear, and it just frayed my last bit of patience. As calmly and nicely as I could, I called out to her and asked her to quiet down. She didn't reply, so I asked again, and she still didn't answer. So I left the bedroom and found her in the living room, watching a movie. She wasn't whistling anymore, and for some reason, that really irked me. It felt like she was messing with me, and then she just looked over at me, like she didn't even know what my deal was. I asked her if she could stop that whistling so much, and she told me she wasn't whistling. Now, I get that maybe she doesn't realise she's doing it, but no one whistles that much and doesn't notice. It's not really like her to mess with me like that, and I don't know what she's trying to get out of this. I thought maybe she was teasing or playing a joke, but she had to see how annoyed I really was. I asked her again to just stop whistling so loudly, and she didn't answer. There was tension in the room, and it felt like our first fight since moving in together. Even though she didn't whistle for the rest of the night, I couldn't focus on my work anyway, because I was upset about the confrontation. Then, of course, the next night she was whistling again. I hear her when she comes home from work, and she just keeps going for at least an hour. I really didn't want to have another fight, so I just hung out in the bedroom and listened to her move around for a while. I felt like I was blowing things out of proportion, but honestly, how hard is it to just not whistle all the fucking time? It was no big deal when it was just now and then, but I feel like she whistles more than she even talks to me now. So, I'm sitting in the room thinking about that, and that's probably why I was so worked up when I finally came downstairs. She was cooking dinner, which is sweet, but she was also still whistling. So I said, softly, "Hey honey, maybe we should just put on some music instead, so you don't have to feel the silence of all that whistling." I tried to play it off like a joke, but I knew she'd probably see through it and get annoyed again. She didn't even turn to face me. She just huffed and kept cooking. After a minute, I told her I was sorry about the other night, but the whistling just sort of strikes my ear wrong, and if she could try not to whistle so much and so loudly, it would make my life a hell of a lot easier. I feel like I was being fair. I know it seems controlling and nitpicky, but it was bothering me a lot. We all have our things, you know. I try not to chew loudly at the table because it bothers her, so why can't she just stop whistling sometimes for me? But she totally freaked out. She turned around and told me she wasn't whistling and she didn't know what my problem was. At this point, I don't get why she was doing this. It obviously wasn't funny for either of us, and she seemed genuinely upset, so I don't know why she just kept provoking me. I asked her what her deal was, why she was so defensive about the stupid whistling, and she told me to shut up. She told me she was sick of talking about it, like I was the one being unreasonable. I never get mad at her, but I just snapped. I told her to stop whistling before I lost my mind. She called me crazy just because I was getting a little upset, and somehow that was all I could take. I grabbed one of the cast iron pans from the stove and swung it at her head as hard as I fucking could. She fell over, and smashed her head on the counter, but I swung the pan again before she hit the ground. I think I maybe hit her 3 or 4 times. I don't remember, but I feel horrible. There was blood everywhere, and her jaw might be broken. No, I think it is for sure. I couldn't believe I'd lost my temper like that, and I have no idea how we can move past this. I feel so ashamed for letting things get physical, regardless of how much she might have been provoking me. But here's the real kicker. She's still fucking whistling. And I asked her nicely to please stop, and now she won't even pause. For 2 days, she's just been lying on the kitchen floor with her eyes rolled back and her mouth hanging open, just marinating in congealed blood, and she's still fucking whistling. I don't know what to do. I don't want to break up, but this is just too much. I need her to shut up. Just shut up. Just fucking shut up. My wife Lynn and I have been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Our entire history together has been very normal, and not once have I noticed any weird behaviours or red flags. I can't stress enough how out of character this whole thing is for her. Lynn is very kind, intelligent and thoughtful. She's always been the no-nonsense type of person. Being childish or trying to scare me is not something she'd normally do. She doesn't even like watching horror movies. When we first started dating, she agreed to watch The Shining with me because she knew how much I loved horror. She was so scared that she didn't even make it through half of the movie before we had to turn it off. She isn't into anything creepy and has never been into pranks. It's just not her cup of tea. And that's fine. But that's what's so strange about all of this. It's just so unlike her. I should also add that she'd never had any mental health issues, and as far as I'm aware, it doesn't run in her family. I know some people are able to hide their mental health problems, but in the 6 years we've been together, I think I would have seen some sort of sign. 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen making myself some coffee before work. I was running a bit late that morning, and I knew I wouldn't be able to make it to Dunkin' Donuts for my usual morning fix. I took a sip of my coffee as I hurried down the hall towards the front door, when I happened to notice Lynn peeking at me from around the corner ahead of me. I could only see her eyes, and a strand of her long, dark hair hanging up against the wall. The rest of her body was concealed behind the corner. I nearly spilt my coffee when I saw her, but I did also burn the shit out of my lips. "Geez, Lynn," I said, whipping a few drops of coffee from my pants. "You scared the shit out of me." She immediately popped out of view like a little kid that had been caught. I heard her scurry off towards the living room, and by the time I got to the front door, she was out of sight. It was really weird, and just totally out of character for her, like I said, but I also found it kind of funny that she was being more playful and a little less serious. I shouted out that I loved her and called her a weirdo as I shut the door behind me, hearing her laughing. Her behaviour was a little bit odd, yes, but it certainly wasn't something I'd call a priest out for. I forgot about it by lunch, and by the time I got home, she was her normal self. I didn't bring it up, and neither did she, and life went on. The next incident happened 3 days later. It was around 2 AM, and I'd woken up to get a drink. I was standing at the kitchen island, jug of OJ in my hand, when I felt a strong feeling that I was being watched. For whatever reason, I looked down at the floor and saw my wife's smiling face staring back. She was peeking at me from the other side of the island, staring up at me with wide, unblinking eyes and grinning. I screamed, I'll admit it, not out of irritation, but fear. For some reason at that moment, I was scared. At the sound of my scream, Lynn scuttled backwards out of my view, her hands and feet smacking the tile floor as she hurried out of the kitchen on all fours. I didn't run after her, or even yell after her. I just stood, frozen in shock, wondering what the fuck had possessed her to do that. It took me a little longer than I'd like to admit to go back upstairs, but eventually I did. When I got to our bedroom, Lynn was lying on her side, asleep. Or at least pretending to be. I stood there for a while, watching her breathe to be sure she was really asleep. I had a feeling she might jump out at me the moment I got into bed, but she didn't. I climbed into bed and she didn't even move. Her breathing was soft and deep, and I was starting to wonder if I had dreamt the whole thing. The next morning I waited for her to come down for a coffee, and after handing her a mug and kissing her on the cheek, I decided to ask about it. "What was that about last night?" I asked, keeping my tone light so I didn't offend or embarrass her. She frowned over her cup of coffee, shaking her head like she had no clue what I was referring to.
You were peeking at me again, from over there,
I said, pointing to the spot on the floor by the kitchen island. She followed my gaze, and when she looked at me, she burst out laughing. She was laughing so hard that I couldn't help but join her.
You creep me the fuck out sometimes, you know that?
I said. She giggled and set her cup on the counter and wrapped her arms around my neck.
You creep me out all the time, so I guess we're even.
We said our goodbyes and left for work. As I drove, I kept thinking about how creepy it had been seeing her grinning at me from behind the island like that. The sounds her hand made on the floor as she crawled away. I told myself she was just trying to be silly, just trying to join me in my love for all things horror. It's not like I was afraid of her, but it just didn't sit right with me. I started seeing her peeking at me more and more. Sometimes she'd be peeking out from behind the couch or living room curtains. Once, she even managed to get inside of her grandmother's old trunk that sits at the foot of our bed. I might not have known she'd been there at all if it wasn't for the trunk's old hinges giving her away. She'd had the lid propped up just enough so only half of her face peeked through. She'd been grinning like an excited toddler. It was unnerving. I didn't even know what to say to her. All I could do was stare. When I finally found my voice, I asked her why on earth she was doing this. But she didn't answer. She just slowly closed the lid, shutting herself inside the trunk. I walked away, feeling utterly disturbed. I didn't understand why she was doing it, but it clearly made her happy. I just hoped she would tire out of the game quickly. Lynn didn't peek at me for the next 2 weeks, and I started to think she was done with her weird little prank, and I was relieved. We were watching a show on Netflix one night, and I jokingly said I hadn't seen her peeking at me lately, and that she must have given up on her spy game. She looked up at me with a smile and said, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." I didn't say anything, but I wondered whether or not she was joking. For the next few days I couldn't stop thinking about what she had said. Was she still peeking at me when I wasn't looking and I just hadn't noticed? And if so, what the hell was she getting out of this? I started to feel paranoid, constantly checking whether she was watching me from round the corner or behind the door. I was jumpy whenever I was at home and she wasn't in full view of me. I felt stupid and a little bit crazy, but after a few weeks without another incident, I began to relax. I stopped checking behind furniture and walls and told myself it was just a bad memory. Then, a few days ago, things got so much worse. Lynn left to go to her friends, and I lounged on the couch and played a couple of games on my laptop. Around 9 PM, I hopped in the shower, and as I was washing the soap from my hair, I felt that awful feeling that I was being watched. I slowly opened my eyes and almost had a heart attack. Lynn was peeking at me from behind the shower curtain, her entire head stretched into the shower, leaving just her body outside. Her long dark hair hung up against the curtain, the ends dripping with water. Her mouth hung open with a terrible grin, her eyes wide and red as if she hadn't blinked in a month. I screamed and jumped back against the wall. She didn't move, nor did her smile waver. Her makeup ran down her cheeks in 2 black streaks. She looked giddy and completely deranged. Honestly, I was fucking terrified. She stood like that for a few moments, neither of us saying a word. Finally, after what felt like forever, she slowly pulled her hair back out of the shower, and I watched her blurry figure through the curtain as she moved backwards towards the bathroom door. A second later, the bathroom door slammed shut, hard enough to rattle the mirror. I screamed again and jumped out of the shower to lock the door. I stayed inside the bathroom for over an hour. Maybe I overreacted to some of you, but joke or not, I wasn't going to put up with this crazy shit anymore. That's what I kept telling myself as I paced around in my bathroom, stopping to listen at the door every few minutes. Suddenly, I heard a muffled sound, and I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, straining to listen. I couldn't hear anything, but I envisioned Lynn standing on the other side of the door, giggling at her own joke. I felt a surge of anger. I was beyond pissed at being made to feel scared in my own house, and made to hide in my bathroom for over an hour. All for what? Some joke? If it was a joke, it was a fucking awful one. "What the fuck, Lynn?" I snapped. "This shit is getting really annoying." I waited for her to apologise or to call me a jerk, but instead I heard a faint moan. So quiet I wondered if I heard it at all. And then, complete silence. "Lynn?" I called out, not being able to even hide the shakiness in my voice. I got no response. just my own heavy breathing.
I swear to God, just fucking stop it.
I yelled, pounding my fist on the door. I waited for her to cuss me out, something I'd expect from me talking to her like that. I'd never, ever screamed at her before this. But there was nothing, just the occasional drip from the shower head. I won't deny that I was scared, too afraid to open the damn door and face my own wife. I waited for another half an hour or so, which feels like a fucking lifetime when you're scared. Finally, I decided I wasn't going to spend the night hiding in my bathroom, so I got down on my knees and peered under the door. I almost expected to see her face peeking back at me, but thankfully I didn't. I could see straight down the hallway to the top of the stairs, but no Lynn. I didn't know if I should be happy about that or not. I waited for a few minutes, waiting to see her head pop over the top step, but it never came. I stood up, my hand hovering over the door, mentally preparing myself to open it. I slowly turned the lock with shaky fingers and was about to yank it open when I heard a sound that still makes me feel nauseous when I think about it. A moan. Louder than before, but this time I was able to tell where it was coming from. I turned my head to the closet door as if in slow motion, and locked eyes with my wife who was peeking at me from the slight gap. Her eyes were still wide as ever, and her mouth was hanging open in the most grotesque, gaping smile I had ever seen. I didn't even scream. I was too scared for that. Her hands were clasped to her chest, body trembling with sheer delight, as if she could barely contain her own excitement. A short, raspy moan bubbled up from her throat, deep and raw, sending a shiver through my entire body. Somehow, I found the ability to pull the bathroom door open and ran as fast as I could all the way down the steps, snagging my keys and phone from the table in the living room before running outside to my car. I could hear her shrill laughter behind me, but I didn't hear her getting closer. I didn't even bother shutting the front door. I drove away from the house faster than I legally should have, shivering the entire time, either from fear or the cold, maybe a little bit of both. I hadn't grabbed a coat or even a pair of shoes. I was still in my boxers and my hair was still damp. I drove straight to my brother Chris's house, about 40 minutes away, ignoring any and every call and text I got. I didn't even check my phone until I was safely parked in my brother's driveway. Lynn had called me 4 times and sent a flurry of texts, all wondering where I had gone and why I left like that. I threw my phone at the dash in a rage, furious at her nonchalant attitude. My brother and his wife were surprised to see me, especially dressed in just a pair of boxers, but told me to stay as long as I needed. Chris lent me some clothes and asked me what happened. I told him about Lynn and about the fight, but didn't get into full details. I didn't want him to think I was overreacting, leaving my wife over a prank, even if it was a strange one. I mean, hadn't I encouraged her for years to lighten up instead of being so serious all the time? I'd wanted her to relax and loosen up, but this was definitely not what I had in mind. I tried to sleep on their sofa, but my brain wouldn't let me sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lynn's face staring at me from inside the closet. Knowing she had been in there with me the entire time made my skin crawl. She had never left the fucking bathroom at all. Instead, she slipped inside the closet and slammed the bathroom door shut to fool me. The mere thought of going back home gave me anxiety. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Chris ended up giving me a sleeping pill, so I was able to get a little bit of rest. However, my sleep was filled with terrible dreams, all of Lynn's smiling face. I woke up as the sun just started to rise. My sore body ached from the sofa, and I felt drained. I knew I'd have to call Lynn at some point, but I didn't know what to say to her. I wouldn't be going home unless she gave me her word she'd never do any more creepy shit again. I just wanted my wife back. Her normal, serious self never looked so good to me. I was contemplating giving her a call and telling her that, when that familiar feeling came over me again, I was being watched. I was staring at the ceiling, my heart in my throat. I didn't want to look away, but the longer I ignored the feeling, the worse it got. My eyes drifted away from the ceiling almost on their own. Her face was pressed up against the window beside the couch, staring down at me with the same gaping smile. Drool dribbled down her lips, leaving 2 long streaks down the glass. I didn't know how long she had been there, but something told me she had been there quite a while, possibly all night. I didn't bother screaming, though I was afraid anger triumphed any fear I felt at that moment. I jumped up from the couch and pounded my palm against the glass.
Lynn, are you crazy? What the hell is wrong with you? Just go home.
I shouted. She didn't move, and her ghastly expression never changed. If anything, her smile only grew, as if she had never been more elated. I could hear Chris and his wife moving around upstairs, as if Lynn could hear them from her place outside. Her head twitched slightly in their direction, and she began to close her mouth slowly. Chris called my name from upstairs, obviously concerned. I turned to see him and his wife Rebecca hurrying down the steps. When I turned back to the window, Lynn was gone. The only sign she'd been there at all was the 2 streaks of drool still dripping down the glass. I tried explaining to Chris and Rebecca about waking up to see Lynn watching me through their window, but they were sceptical. Who wouldn't be? Chris and I went outside to the spot in front of the window where she had been, but there were no footprints in the dirt, just a slight indent. I called out of work that day and turned my cell phone off. I didn't want to face Lynn. Just talking to her was too much for me at that point. I really started to believe something was irreversibly wrong with her, that no matter what promises she made, she'd never be the same again. The thought saddened me to my core. I cried most of the morning. By noon, I figured I was ready to confront her, give her one last chance to explain herself. I could at least give her that after 6 years, I told myself. I turned my phone on and saw dozens of texts she had sent, all from a seemingly concerned wife. Can we talk? I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home. And more of the same, all texts telling me she loved me and she wanted me home, how worried she was. Not a damn one addressing the crazy shit she pulled, like she hadn't been acting like a character from a Stephen King book. Even her texts were different. She normally texted novels just to tell me to pick up a loaf of bread. You'd think she'd have more to say to me after the bizarre shenanigans she's been pulling. I know it probably seems childish to some of you who are miles away from the situation, but if you saw the way Lynn had looked at me, how she scampered away on all fours like some wild animal, grinning at me from inside the closet like a lunatic, then I think you'd find my reaction was warranted. I ended up staying at Chris's and Rebecca's for another night. I didn't wake up yesterday until afternoon, and thankfully I didn't see Lynn's face watching me through the window. I don't want to pry because it isn't my place, but is this fight something that can be mended? Rebecca asked. She made us both a sandwich for lunch, and I knew she wanted to breach the subject without seeming to be nosy. I don't know, she seems like a different person, I said, choosing my words carefully. I still wasn't ready for her or Chris to know the full extent of the batshit craziness I'd been dealing with. People change, Ben, but she's still the same woman you married. Maybe you both just need to talk through your issues. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed, she said, ever the peacemaker. I think it's beyond that now. I don't think talking would help. I just don't trust her, I said. The words stung in my heart. I missed her and I loved my wife. But how could I live with someone like that? Living in constant fear doesn't sound too appealing. Lynn loves you. She has to be absolutely crushed, she said. I don't know about all of that, I said. Well, she certainly seems like it to me. I've never seen her so upset. Very much unlike the Lynn I know, Rebecca said, shaking her head sadly. It took a full minute for her words to really sink in, and when they did, I felt a dread worming its way through my skin. Wait, what do you mean? You saw her? You saw Lynn? I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Rebecca nodded casually, as if that fact wasn't nightmare fuel. She stopped by this morning just after Chris left for work, she said, cleaning the plates from the table. I didn't see her car though. Maybe she took an Uber or something. Beck, what did she say? Did she come inside? I asked, sweat starting to break out from my forehead. I began looking around, examining corners as though a predator lurked behind them. No, she just asked if you were awake yet, and I said you weren't. I asked if she wanted me to wake you up, but she said no. She just said to let you sleep, she said as she was washing the dishes. That's it, that's all? She didn't say anything else? I asked. No, she looked awful though, like she hadn't slept in days. I think you should call her. I got up from the table and thanked Rebecca for lunch. I felt a little bit better at the knowledge that at least she hadn't come inside. Still, I needed to double check that the doors were locked. I sat for a while trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to go home, but I felt like I owed it to Lynn to help her if I could. Hadn't I sworn an oath to love and honour her through sickness and in health? She clearly was very sick. If she was sick, which I truly believe she was, I had to try and get her the help she needed, but I didn't even know where to start. I didn't want to call the police, and besides, what the hell were they going to do? And what would I tell them? That my wife was peeking at me? That she was being creepy? As bizarre as she had been, she still hadn't committed any crime. Not yet, anyway. The police would probably have said that I was overreacting, but this wasn't some prank. It felt wrong, dangerous even, like something sinister lurked beneath her smile. I knew as her husband I was well within my rights to have her committed, but what if she simply acted normally in their presence? She had obviously been able to fool Rebecca into thinking she was just a concerned wife. As long as the doctors didn't find her a danger to herself or others, they'd have no choice but to release her after 72 hours. I felt lost and overwhelmed, so I did what any husband in my position would do. I called her mother. I didn't want to, believe me. Her mother and I weren't on the best of terms. We never fought or anything like that, but we just didn't get along. She wasn't a very warm person and wasn't really easy to get along with at all. She hardly ever smiled, and when she did, only her lips would move into a thin smile, leaving her eyes as blank as before. She gave off this aura that felt like she was permanently on the offensive. I'd only met her twice, and both times were for such short visits. I got the impression she didn't approve of me for her daughter. Lynn always ushered us out quickly, as she didn't want me to feel uncomfortable, which I was grateful for. Being in her mother's company felt almost unbearable, like walking on glass. I was so glad when we moved 3 states away, as we didn't have to see her as often. I was happy to avoid the woman, but now I needed her help. I really didn't want to have to talk to her at all, but I had to talk to someone, and someone who knew Lynn better than I did. So I grit my teeth and did what I had to.
Yes?
She answered, already sounding irritated.
Marie, it's me, Ben. Do you have a minute to talk?
I asked. I could hear her cluck her tongue in irritation.
I'm in the middle of writing some checks, but if you insist, I suppose I could spare a moment. What is it that you want to discuss, Benjamin?
She said, coldly.
It's about Lynn. She's been acting strangely, and I was wondering if you had any idea whether there was something...
I was quickly interrupted.
It's a bit difficult to follow your ramblings, Benjamin. What is it you want from me?
She asked. I could almost see her standing there in her thin sweater and slacks, tapping her fingernails impatiently on the table.
I just wanted to know if you'd ever noticed any odd behaviour, or possibly any mental health issues.
I asked. There was a long, uncomfortable pause. I couldn't tell if she was just thinking, or something else. Finally, after a few seconds, she spoke.
I'm not sure if this is one of your jokes, Benjamin, but if so, I don't find the humour in it. Now, I do have business to attend to, as I've said, so if you don't mind...
She said, but I cut her off before she could get rid of me.
Marie, it's not a joke. I'm sincerely concerned about Lynn's mental health. Her behaviour has been very erratic lately. I'm very worried about her, and I figured as you're her mother, you would know her best.
I said, my frustration evident in my voice.
If you're truly concerned, then I suggest you get health professionals involved. I don't know what you expect of me.
She snapped. I could tell she was seconds away from hanging up, and for some reason I was desperate not to let her. I had the feeling that she knew a lot more than she was letting on.
Please, if not for me, do it for Lynn.
I tried. I heard a faint, shaky intake of breath, as if she was trying to hold her steely persona together, but failing.
Marie, what?
I started.
Benjamin, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice would be to seek professional help. Do not call here again. Goodbye.
I tried to call out to her, but she'd hung up. I tried to wrap my head around the call and her refusal to help me. Even if she didn't like me, why wouldn't she try to help her own daughter? I couldn't understand that. I tried to replay the conversation, desperate to find something I missed. After a while, I almost gave up, until I remembered her last words to me. Seek professional help. She had said those words with a bit of urgency. I could have just been grasping at straws, but no. I was sure her voice had changed ever so slightly when she had said that, as if they were very important. What had she meant? I assumed she was referring to medical professionals, but maybe she was just referring to someone else. Someone that she didn't, for some reason, feel comfortable saying directly. Or maybe I was just desperate. I waited for Chris to get home, and after a very long and exhausting conversation with him and Rebecca, I convinced them that Lynn truly needed psychiatric help. I didn't tell them everything. I wasn't prepared to get into that yet, but I told them about our last encounter, how she'd hidden in the bathroom, peeking at me from the closet. They were obviously shocked, but thankfully they believed me. They too just wanted to help her. Still, they didn't think it was all that serious. Weird, maybe, but not dangerous. They just kept saying that Lynn had to be playing some kind of weird joke. Chris didn't think we should involve the police just yet. He offered instead to go with me, and I readily accepted. He reasoned that calmly talking to her, trying to coax her into going willingly, was the best recourse, and I agreed to do it his way. At least I wouldn't be going into this house alone. We drove over this morning, just after breakfast. There was no way I was going at night. When we pulled into the drive-thru, my stomach began doing somersaults. Her car wasn't there, but I still didn't let my guard down. The front door was ajar, and for a split second I thought we'd see her eyes staring through the gap. I was shaking and starting to sweat. Chris, however, was completely fine. He waited for me to open the door, his hand in his pockets like he was going on a fucking stroll through the park. I envied his ignorance. I pushed the door open and was immediately hit with the stench of rot. Chris smelled it too, and he walked in the house behind me with his nose scrunched up.
What you guys use to clean the floors around here? Shit?
Chris mumbled. Shut up, I said, my eyes darting around for any signs of Lynn. The house was deadly quiet and dark despite being 10 in the morning. All of the curtains were closed up tight, refusing to allow in any sunlight. If I hadn't left in just 2 days prior, I'd have thought the house to be abandoned. We moved through each room, carefully, checking any place that she might hide, occasionally calling her name.
Why the fuck are you looking under the couch?
Chris asked eventually.
Aren't we looking for your wife?
He was looking at me like I was a moron.
Let's just go upstairs,
I whispered. He shook his head but followed me up to the stairs to check the bathroom and the spare bedroom. On the way up, my shoes crunched over pieces of glass that looked to be littered over a few steps. I noticed that one of Lynn and my wedding portraits that hung on the wall alongside the staircase had been smashed. The frame hung crookedly, all the glass removed. I stared at the picture, a lump forming in my throat. We had taken the photo just after leaving the church, after saying our vows. She looked so beautiful in her white gown. I looked at Lynn's beautiful face. I never dreamed her face would ever be the source of terror for me. We climbed the rest of the steps and checked the spare bedroom, but it looked completely untouched. I was hesitant to go into the bathroom, my fear of that night coming back to me all at once. Chris noticed and offered to go in by himself, but I couldn't let him do that, so we just walked in together, checking the closet and the shower. The bathroom looked as if it hadn't been touched since the night I left.
I don't think she's in here, Ben. Why don't you just pack up some clothes and we'll try coming back tomorrow or something?
I nodded and went into our bedroom and shoved some clothes into a duffel bag. When I checked inside our closet, I came across the source of the smell and gagged. Chris took one look and lost all of the colour in his face. He had to go stand by the stairs to get away from the sight and smell. I gazed down in shock at what lay inside my bedroom closet. Soaking into the rug were at least a dozen eyeballs, all carefully laid out in pairs. Some were as large as a quarter, while others were as tiny as a marble. I stared down at the eyes she had collected from small animals and wondered how she had gotten them, and shuddered at the thought.
Man, I thought I had it bad with Becca's shoe addiction, but fuck me, your wife's in here collecting eyeballs,
Chris said, gagging.
Ben, I really think we should go,
he called from the hall. I grabbed my duffel bag and shut the closet door on my new nightmare. I stepped out onto the hall and took a deep breath of air. I could taste the rot on my tongue. I couldn't help but gag.
Who the fuck lines up eyeballs in their closet like that?
Chris mumbled.
I tried to tell you she needed help,
I said.
She doesn't need help, Ben. She needs a fucking exorcist. You coming or what? I can't stand this smell any longer.
His words died in his throat and his eyes grew wide with fear. I asked him why, but I could feel it. Someone was watching me, and I didn't think it was the eyes in the closet. I turned around, my eyes slowly scanning the bedroom. Christ, I whispered as I finally saw what we'd missed. Under the bed, curled on her side, watching us with the excitement of a kid on Christmas morning, was my wife. She held her hands together just under her chin, and they were shaking eagerly. Now that she knew she had been found, I could hear the quiet noises she was making, a sort of hiccuping sound in her throat, as if the excitement was just too much for her. It was unnerving to say the least. Wide eyes and that same huge smile. Everything in me told me to run, but I forced it away. This was my wife. No matter how twisted, she was still the woman I married, still the woman I loved, and I had to help her. "Lynn," I said softly. She didn't respond, but her head bobbled back and forth in two quick little movements as if she was nodding.
Baby, I just want to help, okay? Can you let me do that?
I asked. I had taken a single step forward, approaching her like some kind of dangerous animal.
I love you, Lynn. I really love you,
I said softly, taking another step closer. She let a tiny moan escape her wide open mouth, and I had to resist the urge to run. Her shoulders were starting to quiver, and her eyes grew large as saucers. I crouched down so I could see her better, and immediately saw the blood. Her hands were covered in it. They trembled the closer I got, as if she was barely able to contain herself. "Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding," I said. She bobbled her head again, her bloody fingers moving up and down as if she was playing an invisible piano. They occasionally grazed her chin, leaving smears of blood on her skin. I wanted to recoil in disgust. The smell that was coming off her was revolting. I could feel the vomit from the bottom of my throat trying to climb up and escape. Her lips were dry and stretched thin, blood seeping between the cracks. I knew she wouldn't come out of there on her own, but I didn't want to leave her in the state she was in. I scooted closer and reached out to her. The excited hiccuping sounds got louder and her hands shook, fingers flexing. It was then that I could see the blood oozing from in between her fingers. "Oh God, Lynn, you're bleeding," I said. Instinctively I reached out to take her hand, but before I could even touch her, her hand sprang out towards me. A sharp pain shot through my arm and I fell back onto my arse. My arm burned and I could see the blood dripping down onto the carpet. I looked back at her in shock and saw her grinning madly, her fingers clutched around a shard of glass.
You okay in there?
I turned my head slightly and nodded to him, cradling my arm to my chest. When I turned back to face Lynn, I saw her focus had shifted. She wasn't looking at me anymore, and she wasn't smiling anymore either. She was staring past me, her eyes glaring at Chris the way a hungry lion might stare at a gazelle. Her mouth was still hanging open, but it was twisted into a snarl. I got up onto my feet and began walking backwards down the hall, afraid to take my eyes off her. Are you bleeding?" Chris asked. The moment the words left his mouth, Lynn started fast scooting out from under the bed and the glass shard still in her hand. "Chris, run, go!" I yelled. He must have been too afraid to move because a second later I felt my back bump into him. He was still standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the horror that was my wife. Lynn had crawled completely out from under the bed and stood in the bathroom doorway, her face twisted in rage. Her whole body was visibly tense. Blood ran down her fingers and onto the floor.
"Jesus, Lynn, you playing hide and seek?"
Chris said. I reached back and pushed him towards the steps.
"Move your arse, Chris,"
I said as quietly but firmly as I could. Lynn bobbed her head in fast, sharp movements and began to grin, stretching her mouth open wider and wider so her chin seemed to touch her chest. I heard Chris mutter a prayer and then he began running down the stairs. I stood at the top of the steps, stuck between the love of a woman who clearly needed serious help and self-preservation.
"I only wanted to help,"
I said, choking, holding back tears. Her eyes focused on me once again as she slowly lifted the glass, holding it out in front of her. And then she started sprinting towards me, grinning with utter excitement. Thankfully my body took over and I flew down the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. I made it to the front door before I felt her leap onto my back, wrapping her arms around my neck, her open mouth next to my ear so I could hear those terrible hiccuping sounds up close. I shook her off me, knocking her back to the floor. I felt a searing pain in my back as she went, but I tore open the front door and bolted to my car. Chris was standing in the front yard, talking on the phone with the police. I didn't say a word, I just ran to my car and jumped in. Chris took the hint and followed me, still on the line with 911. I watched the rearview mirror, sure I'd see her there, running after us, but I never did. I went straight to the ER and got 11 stitches in my arm and 3 on my back. The police asked a lot of questions and went back to the house to do a search, but, of course, Lynn wasn't there. They advised me to stay with a friend or a relative for a while and file a restraining order as soon as I could, but none of those things would matter. Somehow, I just knew. I dropped Chris off at home and went to a motel an hour away. I wanted to put as much distance between me and Lynn as I possibly could. This is where I've been for the last 4 hours. I thought maybe the police would find her. Maybe they'd get her the help that she so desperately needs. But now, I don't think so. Because 40 minutes ago, I got a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words.
I found you.
And a picture attached. The picture was dark and grainy, but I instantly knew what it was. There was no mistaking my wife's eyes. I started typing this out immediately after. I don't know what to do. I'm alone and scared, and I can't help but feel that I'm being watched. I met my girlfriend, Victoria, 7 months ago in a bar. We felt an instant connection and started dating 3 days later. She brought nothing but happiness, the perfect definition of a soulmate. So when I graduated from university, we both agreed to move in together. She's 2 years older than me and was already working, so I moved into her house. However, after moving in, everything went downhill. The first incident happened on the first night of moving in. Victoria works night shift, so she was getting ready to head out. "Babe, I'm heading off now. Just to tell you again, the neighbours next door get a little cranky at night, so just ignore them," she said sweetly. Yeah, I get it," I responded. I gave her a kiss goodbye and she left, leaving me alone in her house. I sat down on the kitchen table and got to work. For context, I work remotely as a character designer for a video game company. It was peaceful for a few hours, until the clock hit 2 AM. The cranky neighbours began screaming profusely. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it sounded like an intense argument. I tried ignoring it for a while, but eventually the sound became unbearable. Banging was heard on the walls, glass shattering on the floor, followed by more screaming and arguing. So much so that it sounded like multiple voices overlapping with each other. I tried blasting music in my headphones, but that didn't help. Eventually I couldn't take it anymore, so I called it a night and stopped working. The next day passed by in a flash. I chose not to tell Victoria about the neighbours, since apparently it was normal, and I didn't want her to think that it bothered me so much. It was her house, after all. Nighttime came and I was watching TV on the sofa when the arguments from the neighbours came again. Thumping, glass shattering, furniture being thrown around. You'd think their house is a WWE ring. Suddenly, I started hearing banging on the door, followed by blood-curdling screaming. "What the fuck?" I said while pausing the movie I was watching. The neighbour was trying to break into the house. That's it. That was the last straw. I got up and went to the back door where the banging and screaming was being heard. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen table in case the man would break the door. Thank God it was locked. Just in case, I leaned against it, each punch crushing my back. My heart was racing, my hands were shaking. I didn't even know what to do. For all I knew, this man could seriously hurt me. It felt like an eternity before what I'm assuming is a man stopped banging the door. Concurrently, the screaming stopped, and it was silent. There was no way I was going to live in these conditions. I decided I was going to confront Victoria about it when she got home. With that in mind, I made sure all the doors were locked, windows shut, and went to bed. A few hours later at 6 AM, my girlfriend got home and laid down in the bed next to me. She hugged me from behind and gave me a kiss on the nape, waking me up. "How's everything?" she asked softly. "Were the neighbours loud?" I grunted and turned my head to face her, rubbing my eyes. "What?" Victoria giggled. "How did it go with the neighbours?" I found it strange that she'd asked me that today but not yesterday. Maybe it was me being tired. "The husband tried breaking in," I said. "He banged on the door for at least 2 minutes, screaming. I thought that was the end for me. Seriously, Victoria, I don't think this house is safe for us to live in." She smiled sweetly and said, "As long as the door is locked, you should be fine." I gave Victoria a serious look. "Listen, I can't live with these conditions." I tried to say it as nicely as possible. "I didn't even feel safe in the house last night. You're telling me this is going to happen every single night?" Victoria looked down, her eyelids drooping in discomfort. I felt sorry blaming her for something that wasn't her fault, but obviously we needed to do something about it. I can't fear for my life every night.
I'll call the wife tonight and see if anything can be done.
She hugged me tightly. I smiled and kissed her on the forehead. Thank you, baby. I know it's not your fault, but it's impossible to live in fear in my own house every night. On the following evening, Victoria left for her night shift. Once again, I was left alone in her house. She texted me around 15 minutes later, telling me that the problem was solved and it should be better tonight. I thanked her and laid down on the sofa to wind down. I ended up falling asleep while watching a movie. I woke up a few hours later at 4 AM to screaming from the psychotic neighbours once again. Furious, I got out of bed and prepared myself for confrontation. I was ready to finally get to the bottom of this. However, as I walked closer to the front door, something felt off. I noticed the voices and banging was a little closer than usual, as if they were in the same house. It was the first time I ever paid attention to where the sound was truly coming from, but it was still unexpected. Subtle, but unexpected. Following the traces of the sound, the screams didn't make it to the front entrance, or to the house next door. They took me to the basement door, the only part of the house I haven't gone into yet. My heart began racing. This has to be my hallucinations. The sounds can't be coming from my girlfriend's basement, right? With my legs trembling, I tried to push the basement door open, but it was locked. It only resulted in an even louder screams coming from downstairs. They sounded like a cry for help. What the fuck is down there? I muttered. The thought alone sent shivers down my spine. Thankfully, or unthankfully, my uncle taught me lockpicking when I was younger in case I was ever in a dangerous situation where I needed it. So if there's ever been an opportunity to use that skill, it would be now. I took 2 paper clips and started fidgeting with them inside the lock. In just a few minutes, the door unlocked, but it still wouldn't open. I looked around the house for anything I could use, until I found a crowbar. Using all my might, I pushed the door open. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. Instantly, I heard loud, blood-curdling screams piercing my ears. Screams that you would only hear in horror movies. Covering my ears, I forced my way downstairs. What I saw was horrific. Dead bodies of dozens of guys were organised in a line on the floor across the basement. Worst of all, every guy there looked to be around my age, mainly looking like the exes Victoria talked about in passing. Above them was a jar. Inside it looked to be their faces, with a large glow surrounding them. They were screaming in absolute agonising pain. From what I saw, it looked to be their souls. The sealed, trapped souls of innocent men facing endless pain in the afterlife. The stench was unbearable. Their bodies were bled out, as if everything inside of these men was sucked out, only to leave their pure skin. Despite that, their faces were somewhat recognisable. Every body neatly placed to keep its original shape. Their names written in blood in front of each body. Jack, Noah, Michael, etc, etc. Their screams sounded more like loud gasps from up close. The room was so loud I was getting dizzy. The screams only got louder. It sounded loud enough to screech into my brain. My mind went blank. My body shaking at the thought that this was my girlfriend's creation. It got even worse when I got to the end. Another name was written in blood, with no body behind it, as if it was still being prepared. Dylan. That was my name. And then I got a notification on my phone, a message from Victoria. My heart stopped just by reading it. Hey babe, on my way home. Sorry about yesterday. Let's have some fun tonight.